Hello and welcome to another episode of Musings. My name is Amrita Ghosh, and I have today with me Dr. Rohee Dasgupta to talk about multicultural identity. Dr. Rohee Dasgupta is an anthropologist of Jewish culture and identity. She has conducted ethnographic studies in Poland, Israel, and the US on various projects related to Jewish identity. She teaches advanced graduate courses on identity and conflict at the School of Conflict Studies, St. Paul University, and is a fellow at the Zelikovic Center for Jewish Studies at Carleton University, Canada. She holds a PhD in law, postgraduate certificate in higher education, teaching and learning, and MA in diplomatic studies from Kiel University in the United Kingdom. She also has a second MA in Jewish education from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel, and a bachelor's in English from Calcutta University in India. She has 12 years of academic teaching experience within the fields of international relations, anthropology, European and Israel studies at Kiel and the Open Universities in the UK, Regional Global University in India, and Carleton and St. Paul Universities in Canada. She convened and ran international centers on Israel and European studies at the Jindal School of International Affairs for 8 years in the last decade. Additionally, Rohee has held various international research fellowships at research institutes in Europe and the US and Canada recently related to Jewish culture and history as well as Holocaust education. She immigrated to Canada in 2019 and is presently based in Ottawa. Rohee is also a podcaster and the host of The Outsider Narrative, which features conversations on cultural identities, migrations, and politics. She tweets at her handle at RoheeDG. Welcome to the Musings, Rohee.
Thank you, Amrita. It's a pleasure. And thank you for your kind introduction.
I want to begin with your unique experience, your unique multicultural experience. As mentioned in the bio, and I don't think I specified it, but you have now lived and worked in 19 countries across the world. Firstly, what do you say when you're asked that potent and sometimes very problematic question, in many ways, where are you from? A question that also comes to me often within my only meager 3-country experience. How has this shaped your identity, the 19 countries you've been at?
I think it has humbled me because I've been able to see so many cultures, modes of life, and so many layers that human life and the human experience goes through. It has made me versatile, and it has certainly given me an interesting feeling with belonging. Home is very much in the present context. Home is where I make it. Home is where I create my home. My affiliations are, however, scattered. My affiliations are scattered in context and in cultures. And that's where I feel quite at home at, as any multicultural being would feel, You feel fortunate to create the home whenever you create the home. It has to be meaningful. It has to have a good layer of your own multiculturalness that you bring into the home. And at the same time, you create it. So in my life, with this feeling of home, I think it is far more an acquisition than merely a belonging. I have acquired a feeling of the home as I have traveled, and I have picked up, hopefully, some interesting nuances from different cultures, which has been very humbling and learning. And that is totally my being today. So that's where I am at this moment.
I was going to ask my next question about home, and you kind of have answered that partly, but I'm still going to stay on it for a brief moment. I'm thinking of Salman Rushdie's famous essay where he talks about home as an imaginary homeland. And you have obviously had multiple shifts, as you talked about home being created where you are, literally and metaphorically. But is there one original home that you still think of or have a nostalgia for, or is it still fleeting in some ways?
I have various, so Salman Rushdie, of course, is coming from the literary perspective. And of course, he's a writer with a wonderful imaginary flair itself and very much rooted in various interesting contexts too. For me, I'm an anthropologist. So it has to be within the empirical experience that I can call things home. So I do live in the present moment, but I do bring a lot of things from memory, which can be a part of my belonging. I cannot consider, I guess how should I put it? I guess I'm corrupted enough to say I don't have an original oneness with homeland anymore. Although I have very rigorous understanding of cultural practices, identity, belonging of various homelands, including the one that I was originally born into. That's how I would place it. But yes, memory and cultural belonging, you asked about cultural belonging. I think that is very intertwined in me when it comes to my own being. But also, as I said, where I come from is an acquisition, because when you have the knowledge of various cultures, practices of all everyday life, whether food, whether identity, whether clothes, whether knowledge, whether rituals, whether religious understandings. Not that I'm terribly a religious person, but what I mean to say from an anthropological standpoint, that when it comes with those degrees of nuances, you develop a deference to cultures, you develop an understanding of how you may link your belonging with memory. But I am afraid I do not consider or do not have one original, beginning. That being said, I mean, beginning of feeling that this is my home. That being said, I will have to give a degree of reverence to the city that I was born into. So that is not going away. Calcutta, which is a unique enmeshing of post-colonial cultures and of languages, of international exchange when it came to arts, theater, literature, and identities. So that, of course, in its own little way, as I begun my journey, had its own Calcutta syndrome in me. So languages of the European kind, films of the European kind, theater, and of the radical kind, belonging to the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s politics, made a mark in my life. I belong to talking about belonging, I belong to a middle-class family where politics, political discussion, and education was abundant and very liberal. Gender divisions was sought very gradually in my life through observation, not through personal experience. I consider that very lucky today. So there you go. So there is a beginning, but today through that, through those layers of acquisition, I cannot just say that Calcutta is my hometown anymore, as much as I have a lot of reverence towards it. It's my beginning, but it's not only a part of me. It is definitely a part of me, but not the only part of me.
I can totally relate. I also think that we need to do a whole other podcast on what you said about the literariness and the empirical, and you're coming from the anthropological perspective and me being from the literary perspective. I think that's a whole new episode to be done. But I want to go to your work itself, which is fascinating and intriguing.
Before you go there, could I just add one little understanding about cities?
Absolutely.
When I say, and my mind fleets right into the comparative understandings of cities. Like I know Calcutta very closely in my life, and I have for in my beginning years. I do know Delhi, I know Warsaw, I know Berlin, I know London, and I'm not just talking. I know Ottawa, of course, now, and I know various Jerusalem, Tel Aviv. And certain parts of the tri-state area, Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, St. Louis. So giving you certain names, not just as lists. So taking on those places. So if I've gone to a place and worked there, been there in the culture, I have seen and experienced that place. So going to Krakow was not just a tourist experience. Going to Leipzig is not a touristic experience. It was a part of that acquisition, a very deeply embedded one. And there was minimal ghettoization of belongingness and being into one particular culture and just going out to the city and then coming back to that little cultural ghetto that one usually does. Because there is also another nuance of being the single researcher and single traveler. So you don't have that comfort of being in that ghetto. You are in the world. So that kind of has an added layer to it.
Sure, and I think that gives us a segue into your work itself, because of which you lived in these multiple experiences in different cities. For the sake of our viewers, give us an overview about Jewish studies and how you came to this field of work as an anthropologist.
Mm-hmm. I think I was always interested in leftist ideology and leftist politics. Again, and that's an extraction of my initial belonging for sure. But as I realized about transitions that people made from communism into capitalism, or indeed the post-communist times, the theater, the language, the identities attracted me quite a bit. I went into Europe, pretty much in my early 20s, which was the early part of the 20th century. And I understood that transitions have affected lives geopolitically differently in different parts of Europe, and how it was perceived from outside, sometimes outside of Europe, was layered in different colors and their own interpretations far more. I wanted to experience the reality. I was always interested to understand minority cultures and minority identities, again, that had that fulfillment of literature. Maybe I did not, I didn't have the capacity to perhaps word it in that way at that moment. But something that is unusual and different and unknown to me always attracted to me. And I wanted to always make that unknown familiar. And that was my trigger, one of the triggers. The other part was to see how identity is negotiated. And you can have a private identity and a public identity. And that is negotiated because of political reasons. It could be negotiated because of social integration reasons. So in a way, those were triggers. But I would also say that it has been a very fateful journey. A lot of things pulled me into it. So I often joke and say that I have a dibbuk running my life. I have a Jewish dibbuk, Yiddish dibbuk. Well, dibbuk is Yiddish. I have a dibbuk running my life, who's calling me and taking me on a journey that I would not have considered very normal and natural course. So I got various fellowships while doing my master's at Kiel, because East Central Europe was expanding and they were accessing into the EU. 2003 to 2006 has been an interesting part for East Central Europe as they were becoming a part of the EU. Accession probably started late 1990s for many of these countries. As a result, time plays a role here. Youth leaders from various parts of Europe were chosen irrespective of their passports. And they were asked to come into dialogue with anthropologists, social scientists, dramatists, journalists, left underground journalists even, and talk about their experience and exchanges in the East Central European countries, particularly Hungary, Poland, certain parts of Eastern Germany, certain parts of the Balkans, which I have traveled and interacted. I found the interaction and Czech Republic. So I found these places. I detoured Europe. People do it from generally west to east. I did east to west. And that was, again, a part of that journey that took me. So that interaction and various interactions and various workshops, symposiums, provoked me to think about minority identities a little more deeply. By the time I was doing my master's dissertation at Kiel, I'd already traveled to 6, 7 European countries, most of the Central Eastern European kinds. And I wanted to engage with this politics. I wanted to understand this negotiation of identity. This is one part of the answer. The other part would be um, the memories and the political understanding of partition that plays an interesting role. Obviously, cannot affect me personally. I am born in 1980, but I think I do bear a lot of um, feelings regarding partition and moving away from one's original homeland of my ancestors with me. And not that anyone had to really indoctrinate that in me, but I think I have that in me very much. Um, I am a family. I belong to a family of partition. It's a partition family. So all of my family from my mother's and father's side came from then East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. And I have been aware of many of their stories of travels coming into the land, readjusting their lives, sometimes with struggles, sometimes in a negotiated way. So I was aware of those negotiated conditions. And that also kind of pushed me to think about a parallel story and parallel negotiations of albeit a very different kind. And that provoked me to look into the Jewish story. It was a psychosocial connection. It resonated with me deeply. And I think one of the books picked me up at that moment and said, let's go into the journey, into the Yiddishkeit, into the Yiddish world, into the Polish Jewish world, and then understand our journeys. Because journeys and identity, negotiation of identity, all of that is very normal to me, like like a daily bread almost. And yeah, I was pulled into it. The rest is what it is.
It's unfolding. That's fascinating. And I want to shift to this negotiation of identity and the multicultural experience to a more sort of a gender question. So multicultural experience to me is very different from my East Coast experience in the US, which is very diverse. And then right now I'm based in the south of Sweden, which is different in so many different ways. In Sweden, there are debates on what it means to be a multicultural society. And I've been teaching this text, very interesting collection of voices framed around Susan Okin's very seminal question, is multiculturalism bad for women? And it's a controversial argument she's making in many ways, where she's saying that multicultural societies ignore feminist practices or women's rights, and how patriarchy subsumes immigrant contexts and minority identities by suppressing women's voices. What do you think of the intersections of gender and multiculturalism as a scholar and as a cosmopolitan subject, albeit a minoritized one, in many personal and political ways?
To begin with, personal is always political when it comes to gender and multiculturalism. It is a very deep recognition of what goes on at the intersections. And it is, gender identities within the multicultural context is almost always responding to patriarchal values. The reason is because they understand rights, they understand, and they also understand gendered identities, understand that rights is not a given thing. It's a negotiation. They understand discrimination, not in a politically correct or left liberal fashioned ways always. They understand discrimination, they tolerate, they go through that. And as a result of all of these experience, there is a different, scholarly and even, it's not a lay understanding to law and society. It is a little more embedded understanding. Not everyone is a legal scholar, but people are aware of legislations. People who are often thrown into these contexts of gendered, you know, understandings in multiculturalism, they understand the voices of feminism, which is about equality in society and not just women's rights. They understand about legislation that go in contexts and that, places are different and diverse and they perceive things differently. I am an immigrant right now in Canada. I understand and realize that very well, right? And I have done that earlier too in the UK, in Germany, in Poland, in Israel, in India. You understand whenever there are multicultural societies, whether of the East or the Western kind, that what kind of social mores do you engage with? Are you progressive? Are you neoliberal? Are you more on the conservative side? Are you more centrist? So the customs of the majority becomes quite apparent to gendered identities. That's what I would say. And for gendered identity, there is also an assertion. There's an assertion of who they are. That may come in varying shades and lights depending on how much voice the person has, how much abilities and even perceptions that person has about gender. It's nuanced and it evolves.
That leads me to a more specific question. There are constant scholarly debates on the currency of the term, and I'm wondering whether more than multiculturalism, more and more transculturalism has become a better word to use. And I ask this because the question of alterity or the other always remains within these kinds of multicultural societies, either the marginalized other or dominant structures of multiculturalism, which are managed. So how does one negotiate the two terms towards a more cosmopolitan idea of ourselves?
I'm going to break this question down. Cosmopolitanism is hard to achieve, and it is achieved gradually. And it is not always necessary that the subject will achieve cosmopolitanism, because people, for the most part, unlike me, want to belong, want to consider something original, want to have a framework of belonging, and that's absolutely fine. In fact, cosmopolitans often laugh that we are kind of glocal. We are not global, we are not local, we are glocal. And that's a very uncomfortable place to be. That's not for everyone to be in that place. And I understand. And that's not to say that that's a superior way of being. That is just a way of being not for everyone to feel, right? As I say, anthropology is my only belonging. I think I can belong in that discipline. Whether people will appreciate that belonging is a whole different story. But I think I can negotiate my way. But talking about these two words, multicultural and transcultural, they are opposites. The reason why I say that is because multiculturalism, there is a feeling of going back and forth. And with transcultural, once that is left behind, is perhaps there in memory, in contexts of something, in nostalgia, in a place, but a different reality, a changed reality. So trans is just a one-way street, whereas multiculturalism is probably a little more two-way street that has intersections and all the chaos, which is, so that's why I call multi and trans opposite. And it's also true for global politics today. So what is transcultural and what is multicultural, even for business, for political economy, it bodes meaning. However, that being said, multiculturalism offers certain licenses, offers certain leeways to be oneself amidst other cultures, engage with dialogue. Transculturalism does that, but to a little more um, mixed, a far more mixed and a far more, you know, a far more assimilated way. Multiculturalism may not always be assimilated. In the UK, this debate was pretty much reflected on by Lord Bhiku Parekh in his book Rethinking Multiculturalism. And Gayatri Spivak also deals with that a little in her book Critique of Postcolonial Reason. She does in very, very different contexts. But this is true that multiculturalism has a little more flexibility, whereas transcultural identities are far more assimilated because there is always that leaving behind capacity, whereas multiculturalism is more reflexive in its nature. That's what I feel. And cosmopolitanism is hard to achieve and it's not for everyone to accept.
Thank you for this very fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Amrita. It's been a pleasure.